The book spans 400 years of history, and the word Manchuria goes back about 400 years. For me, Manchuria is a beautiful word. It's an evocative word in the tradition of Patagonia or Siberia. And so the book details two kinds of time. It's structured around two kinds of time. One is this ephemeral, historical, man-made time, these different eras of governance and people trying to impose their will on this land they called Manchuria. And the land always resisted them. These things often, almost always failed. The second type of time in the book is the growing season around a farm. And it's a farm that my wife grew up on. And my wife is fluent in English. She went to university in Beijing. She graduated from law school at Berkeley. She referred to this region as Manchuria as well in English. Chinese today call it Dongbei. They call it the Northeast. And the book's title in Chinese is Dongbei Youji. It means journey to the Northeast, because the word Manchuria wouldn't mean anything to a contemporary Chinese reader. It'd be a historical relic. But to call the book in Northeast China in English doesn't have the same romanticism, nor does it encompass, like I said, these historical periods and also this agricultural seasons that I'm explaining. Northeast, I'm calling it Manchuria too because the Northeast still retains a distinct sense of regionalism, a distinct sense of otherness, which is why people, if you say, 我是东北人, people in China will immediately associate attributes to you that you can't find anywhere else in the country. It was much easier to fit into the social structure of the village than it was my tiny neighborhood in Beijing. One reason for that is in the Northeast, when you see a stranger on the road, you often don't greet them with 吃饭了没有, like the way they do the rest of China, have you eaten? Instead, you say, 谁家的呀? Meaning, whose family do you belong to? And that's in Dongbei-hua, in the local accent. And when you answer, well, I belong to this family, in my case, my wife's family name, or even my roommate, the family I lived with, immediately you were put in a slot of somebody's understanding of going, okay, good, I know where you fit into the neighborhood structure now. But I found it, because of that intimate connection I had by just being there and being affiliated and related to some of the people there, people were much more welcoming than they were in Beijing when they had a natural inclination to keep their distance a bit because who's this foreign stranger coming in here? The thing I learned as a Peace Corps volunteer 20 years ago in China and also doing the Beijing book was that sort of parachuting in, asking direct questions and expecting direct answers was not going to work. It's not an efficient way of conducting research in China. And so what I would do was just live my life. I was training for a marathon during the summer, so I'd be out every morning running. I was teaching at the elementary school, so I'd go to class and have a schedule around that. I would often walk past my aunt's home on the way back to my house, so I'd stop in and chat with her. And slowly but surely, details start emerging by very natural questions. When did you get married? When was so-and-so born? What were the 1960s like? And you start, these things start layering on top of one another, and you start getting that narrative that builds up over time. I told people, just like I did with the Beijing book, that I was writing a book about history and the village history. And I was lucky with the Beijing neighborhood because they're very proud of their history because it's the oldest neighborhood in Beijing. Wasteland, the village I was in, they're also very proud of their history because they're among the forerunners of modern Chinese agriculture. And so they want to talk about the success they've had there. It isn't a backward place. Their per capita income is higher than your average Chinese farmer. They're growing organic rice before other farms are doing this. And so they feel quite proud of their success because most of the people that are there remember when it really was a wasteland, when there wasn't this rice cultivation going on there and these fields that they've opened. Recent history, what it was, it's on a floodplain of the Songhua River. And so in the 50s, this particular area where I was living was actually underwater, about ankle deep to knee deep water. After the Communist Revolution, after land redistribution happened, when people were moved to this area, they drained the swamps, they flattened the paddies by themselves with boards on their feet and walked it. And the farming was done communally there. But surprisingly, because it is flat paddies, mechanization didn't happen until quite recently. And it's being powered by Eastern Fortune Rice, the local agribusiness that now is bringing in automatic planters and mechanized threshers to do the harvest. China right now is this urbanization push, right? And they're trying to move the majority of people off the farms into cities. But there's a lot of pressures on cities. And so one way cities are making their urbanization targets is simply enlarging the borders of their city. And so Wasteland has recently been gobbled into Jilin city's border, which for school kids and the local community is a good thing because the infrastructure has improved. And also now teachers from central Jilin city can be assigned or hired out in the countryside to work these places. It also means that there's more of a flow and ebb between villagers in Wasteland and Jilin city folk. Some will live in the village and go to the city to work, or vice versa. This is another interesting thing about living in the Northeast, is that when you live in central and southern China, you're really dealing with Han Chinese culture, both historically and culturally. In the Northeast, though, you still see all these overlapping lines, these blurred identities that have taken place, especially over the last 100 years. So you have, obviously, the ethnic Manchus, who are indigenous to the region and what they've left behind. You have the Mongolians on the western steppe and their farming techniques they've used over time and the development they've done. You have the Koreans, which are now in North Korea, who crossed the border 100 years ago and brought rice cultivation to this region. You have the Russian influence still from Siberia, but also in the railway network and a lot of the architecture that you see there. And then you have this Japanese history and Japanese past, which is an identity and a history that is still being written and sort of sorted out because of this Millions to Manchuria campaign that brought around 300,000 Japanese farmers over to Manchuria, people that ended up intermarrying, people that ended up dying in the region and were buried there, and their families still come from Japan to visit them, orphans that were left behind by mothers and soldiers who were fleeing, who were raised by Chinese parents. And so you have this unresolved narrative too of where we slot them in with modern Chinese history, let alone regional history. But one thing that I loved about living in Wasteland and in the Northeast was just this sense of open space and exploration and how fun it was to travel there. And one of the reasons it's fun to travel there is the railway network that the Russians and then the Japanese improved upon, built and improved upon, and then the communists after them. That train system reaches into every nook and cranny of the region. Another thing that surprised me is that given all the occupations that have taken place in the Northeast in the last 100 years, how many relics of those occupations still exist? But other relics were things that I was discovering for the first time on my own that didn't have signposts on them, that were not yet patriotic education bases. And that was exciting for me too, because when you're a writer in China, you always hear 5,000 years of history, 5,000 years of history, and everything's been discovered, everything's been posted for you, everything has a souvenir stand out front. Whereas in the Northeast, I could travel to the remains of places like the Willow Palisade, for example, and I could have it all to myself, that no one else would be out there as I was exploring this history.